Ram Ram. Welcome to the Wise Stories. Today is Sunday and my name is Yuvragi. Here I am with yet another wonderful fun story for you all. It's called Nehle pe Dehla, which means one above the other. There were three brothers who were the biggest storytellers in the world, and their stories were just unbelievable. You know, when you're small and you weave stories that, oh, I'm a fairy and I have magic powers and I can be invisible, and your parents believe it. But when you become older, like my age, and then you tell such stories, nobody believes you. And they say, what rubbish? What are you talking? What nonsense? Well, these three brothers were in that category. And they would rattle off stories which were one unbelievable than the other. And the whole village was fed up of their habit. Once they were traveling and they stopped at a little guest house. In the guest house was a prince. They had never seen a prince in their lifetime. Handsome prince with silk clothing and jewelry. And when they saw him, they felt a pang of jealousy. They wanted those riches for themselves. So they came up with a plan. They wanted to fleece and fool the prince. So they approached the prince and said, Your Majesty, we are all staying in the same guest house. How about we have a session of stories? We will all narrate stories, and that's how we will pass our time in the evening. What would you say? The prince was excited about the proposition. It seemed like a good way of entertainment. Now we just turn one switch on and then keep switching on other channel to the other. In those times, stories were a good way of entertainment. So the prince was all on board. The other brother added, no, let's have a condition. Let's make it more fun and exciting. We will all do a round of stories, and whoever is narrating a story, if the other person, whoever reacts saying unbelievable, just cannot be, or gives a reaction, that person will become a slave to the storyteller, the one who's narrating the story. So it was agreed. Now, in order to have a fair judgment and no contradictions and no fights, they assigned one elderly gentleman who was also living in that guest house as the judge. Then they all sat down. The first brother started to narrate the story. And he said, When I was a little boy, we were playing hide and seek. My brothers here were looking for me, and in order to hide from them, I climbed up a tall tree. While they kept looking for me, in the morning, they couldn't find me until dusk, and they went back home. While now it had become dark, and I knew that it was hard and difficult for me to get down this tall tree. In the dark, and I was so up on the tree, I could get hurt. So I came up with a plan. I went to a nearby village, borrowed a rope, tied it to the tree, and smoothly climbed down. What rubbish! You must be thinking, what kind of a story is this? Makes no sense. If he did climb down to get the rope, then he already climbed down. Why would he climb up again and climb down by the rope? Stupid and silly. Of course, that's a reaction you and I, smart people, would give. But the prince just smiled. The second brother, who was the next in line to tell the story, was shocked that the prince gave no reaction. Usually, the person listening to the story would say, What bullshit! But the prince just smiled. The second brother went on to tell a story, and his story started like this. Oh, well, my elder brother was hiding up on the tree, and I was looking for him. I felt a flutter behind a bush. I was curious, so I looked behind, and I saw a big ferocious lion with his mouth wide open. I put the strongest pressure on my feet and jumped straight into his stomach. He did not even have the time to chew me. And when I was in his stomach, I jumped. You know, just how you want to jump on soft beds and mattresses in your parents' room. I jumped until that poor lion had a bad stomachache and he vomited me with such gusto that I flew out of his mouth and landed 100 feet far away in the middle of the village. And the lion was so relieved that he ran away. I dusted myself and stood up and got a lot of applause from the villagers because I saved the village from the wrath of that lion who never ever turned back towards our village because he was scared of me. Bullshit. Yeah, I know. Well, the prince didn't give any reaction and he still smiled. Oh, the two brothers looked at each other. Well, up next was a third one, and he had even a more unbelievable story. He started, one day I was strolling along the ocean and I saw these crestfallen, upset, sad fishermen. I asked, what's wrong? They replied, they hadn't eaten for a week. Their families were without food because they had not caught any fish. I wanted to help them and I wanted to find the real reason why they couldn't catch any fish. Where were all the fish? So I disguised myself into a little fish and swam into the middle of the ocean. There I encountered a huge demon-like fish. Oh my God, it was really huge. And that demon-like fish was the real reason why all the fish had run away or were hiding or were eaten by it. I poked that big fish and that fish started to chase me. And with swiftly I swam to the shore while the huge demon-like fish followed me. There at the shore, all the fishermen were ready with their spears and their swords, and they attacked that big demon fish and killed it. They got food for their families and they caught a huge gigantic fish. They thanked me and was so relieved. Well, interesting imagination, I would give that to him. But the prince just smiled. The three brothers looked at each other. Now they knew that they cannot at all express disbelief at whatever story that the prince narrates because it is the prince's turn. So they agreed that we will, whatever he says, we will just believe it. We are not going to say unbelievable because otherwise we will become his slave. So they had this agreement, unspoken gestures, and the prince started with his story. He said, I am a prince of a big kingdom. I don't even know how much money is there in my royal treasury. But today I am in search of my 3 loyal servants. I really loved them and trusted them, but they ran away. I took it upon myself to find them and I looked for them everywhere. And today I am so thrilled that I have met them again. Would you like to know who those 3 slaves are? It's you, 3 brothers. Oh my God, the 3 brothers were taken in for a ride and the prince was so clever. So if the 3 brothers deny that the prince is lying and this story is unbelievable, they become his slaves. If the 3 brothers don't say anything, which means they believe his stories, they are already his slaves. So either case, they are the prince's slaves. The prince really was one up above all 3 of them. Nehle pe Dehla. So they looked towards the elderly man who was the judge for the entire storytelling session, and he replied that the prince had won. The 3 brothers were now the slave to the prince. Oh, they fell to the feet and they begged for forgiveness and said, Oh, Royal Highness, we will never ever fool anyone. We will never ever cook stories. We will never ever say a word, we promise you. Please, please, please forgive us. Let us go. Don't make us your slave. So the prince laughed it off and forgave them, and from that day onwards, those three brothers checked their tongue every time they would want to tell an unbelievable story. I hope you enjoyed this story for this Sunday. We will meet next Sunday. Ram Ram.